Just over a century ago, there was an isolated kingdom called Hawaii, an independent nation with a parliament, its own flag, a national anthem, and a beloved queen, Liliuokalani. But in 1893, she was removed from her throne with the help of the United States Marines. It was a great loss to her people.
If you can imagine something within your own culture that is tremendously important to you that is suddenly done away with, just totally ripped out and gone. If you can imagine yourself relating to something like that, that's what we went through.
Liliuokalani was descended from generations of chiefs, revered by the Hawaiians as gods. She had been educated by Americans. A poet and composer, she dined at the White House, was a guest at Buckingham Palace, but nothing had prepared her for the crisis she would face as queen.
Liliu was well-versed in the Western culture, well-versed in the Hawaiian culture, and knew the values of both sides, and knew the inevitable of what was going to happen to Hawaii.
When Liliu was born in 1838, the chanting lasted for days. It was the way to herald new arrivals among the ali'i, the high chiefs of the islands. But by this time, many of the old ways had already vanished. The greatest change had been brought by a small group of Congregationalist missionaries from New England, who had landed in the islands almost 20 years earlier. It would be their grandchildren who would one day overthrow the queen. By the time Liliuokalani was born, a third of the Hawaiians were Christian. Nudity was banned, the hula outlawed. The missionaries had developed a written Hawaiian language and taught virtually the entire adult population to read and write. More and more Hawaiians were accepting Western ways.
They were able to just rip out the essence of that which our native soul related to and cast it down and said, now you relate to this, which was the new culture they had brought in. And if the missionaries were like Jesus Christ, it would have worked beautifully, but they were not. They were human beings.
In the harbors, an increasing number of American ships were stopping to refuel on their way to Asia. Hawaiian chiefs could now see that their future lay with the world beyond the islands. They turned to the missionaries for help.
They did a remarkable thing. They created a school only for the children of the 7 families which would be appropriate to rule. And they simply turned their children over to an American missionary couple and allowed them to just take them and train them any way they wished.
Liliu was one of 16 royal or ali'i children sent by their families to attend the school.
Liliuokalani at that school was exposed to influences quite other than simply Christian or learning to read and write. I mean, for example, to dress and speak and behave in ways of polite American society, to be strictly regulated by time, self-discipline, thrift, self-denial. I'm not suggesting that all of this was fully accomplished, but they certainly did learn at least the trappings of polite American society very thoroughly there.
She would be called by her Christian name, Lydia. A brilliant student, she learned languages and music and read biographies of English kings and queens. By the time she finished her education, she was easily the most accomplished young woman in the islands.
I think that you cannot underestimate the force that the school had on providing the children with a sense of their own importance, their own role in Hawaiian history. The missionaries had that sense of their importance, and I think they bestowed it upon the ali'i, the children, that they had an obligation and responsibility to the Hawaiian nation when they would become rulers.
They would rule in a court that emulated the elegance and ceremony of the British monarchy, and even adopted their parliamentary system. But it was from this point on that the Hawaiians began to lose political control.
Once a constitutional form of government was established, then the king had to rely upon foreign advisors to run the government, because none of the Hawaiian chiefs had been trained in running a whole constitutional government. And so many of the missionaries assumed roles in the cabinet.
Foreigners became increasingly powerful, not only in the government, but also in the royal family. In 1862, when Lili'u was 24, she married into the American community. Her husband, John Dominus, came from a prominent Boston family.
They were married, but not to, I think, the favor of his mother, who always looked upon her as a non-Caucasian and as someone who she was not going to accept into her house with open arms, despite the fact that she was a princess.
The couple would live in his mother's home, Washington Place, a plantation-style house in the middle of Honolulu. It was not a happy household. Lili'u wanted a family of her own, but was never able to bear children. And she was frequently lonely, her husband preferring to socialize without her. But she would find herself in music. In her memoirs, she wrote, "To compose was as natural to me as to breathe. This gift remains a source of the greatest consolation."
Day in and day out, she would write. It was indeed a place of refuge for her. Most of her inner feelings in the latter part of her life were all recorded through song.
Over time, she would compose 165 pieces and would write one of Hawaii's most famous songs, Aloha Oe.
She would use Western melodies and had the ability to write in the Western style with harmonies and supporting the melodic line. And then she also wrote in the style of the ancient way.
Lili'u became expert in the ancient chants at a time when traditions were being lost. The Hawaiians themselves were disappearing. The ali'i were dying off at an alarming rate. Epidemics and alcoholism, diseases of foreign contact, were taking their toll. Kings were dying young, without heirs. When Westerners had first arrived in the islands in 1778, there were 800,000 Hawaiian people. Only 50 years later, 80% of the population had perished.
As many said, the Hawaiians were dying not only of disease. I think it was Robert Louis Stevenson that commented they were dying of cultural malaise.
Everything about the Hawaiian way of life seemed to be vanishing. More and more Hawaiians were losing control of their land. The missionaries had pushed through complex reforms they claimed were democratic, but that would ultimately benefit only a small minority.
The common people ended up with less than 1% of the land combined. Soon after that, laws were passed enabling foreigners to own land in Hawaii, and the way was open for them to purchase lands from the chiefs or from the government.
Now, the traditionally large and close-knit Hawaiian families were being scattered. People were forced to seek work in the towns.
So it turned out to be a disaster for the native Hawaiians. But of course it turned out to be a bonanza for the foreigners, and that included the mission children, who made good use of these possibilities and became very swiftly quite affluent landowners.
Although she herself was married to a foreigner, Liliuokalani became increasingly critical of their growing power in the kingdom. But she had yet to realize just how powerful they would become. In 1874, Liliu's brother, Kalakaua, became king. He named his sister heir to the throne. She was 38 years old. The king was Liliu's temperamental opposite, extravagant, opportunistic, and always flamboyant. Kalakaua staged some of the greatest celebrations in Hawaiian history. The Royal Hawaiian Band captured the king's spirit in the Kalakaua March.
He had a 2-week birthday party. He had a grand ball, he had a hula program, he had a great luau for 10,000 people. Everything that both cultures could provide were put at the service of this one event.
Kalakaua shared his sister's dedication to Hawaiian tradition. He brought back hula, which had been banned since missionary times.
Oftentimes called the Merry Monarch, I think he's looked upon mostly for his lighter side and his love of music and dance. But His Majesty was intensely nationalistic and intently driven by a need to, I think, preserve the sovereignty of Hawaiian rule in the Hawaiian kingdom.
At first, Kalakaua allied himself with the landowners. It was natural because he himself owned thousands of acres. In 1876, he traveled to Washington to secure a treaty so that Hawaiians could sell sugar to the United States tax-free. In time, the treaty would prove disastrous in ways Kalakaua could not foresee. But when it first went into effect, Hawaii's economic future seemed secure. Liliuokalani wrote, "The planters were elated. The merchants were encouraged. Sugar companies declared fabulous dividends."